I'm excited that we're going to learn more about the sanctuary, and then we can go back into it. Next time you're then physically in the sanctuary, you're going to know what you're looking at.
Yeah.
Bring new meaning.
Rabbi, while we're waiting for people to join, do you want to give a minute or two on Pride Shabbat?
This Friday night in the sanctuary is our third Friday to be back in the temple. We are asking for people to RSVP ahead of time. So there's a link in the email that went out or on our website. But there should be room as we're upping the numbers. And while Portland Pride is virtual again this year, this weekend, we're still wanting to honor Pride Shabbat as we've done for the last several years. And we have a guest speaker, Mickey Gillette from Basic Rights Oregon, who was the leading organization in the state for LGBTQ rights. And we've worked with the organization for years and years and support them volunteer hours, support them financially, all those different ways. And she's going to be speaking to us about what's going on in Oregon and especially what's going on around the country right now and ways that we can get involved in what we can do. So please join us Friday night, either in our beautiful space that you can see here, or we're still streaming it to Facebook Live on our stream from our website and on Zoom.
Very good. Thank you.
Be there.
Well, welcome everybody to Teaching Tuesdays. Teaching Tuesdays is a program of a new initiative effort at CBI called Community Connections. And the goal of our group, the goal of the program, which started back in the fall, is to connect members of our synagogue community for social, for spiritual, for just fun, and with the goal of strengthening our connections. So we have invited members of the community to share their expertise, their passions in these sessions. And I think this is about our 6th or 7th monthly session. And I'm going to ask everybody, if you haven't already done so, to please mute yourselves and to use the chat for your questions, which will be monitored. And our presenter will have an opportunity to respond to your questions at the end of the hour. This session is being recorded and will be available for sharing and review at some point soon on the CBI website. And we can get a little more information later about how to find the event, this event, and previous Teaching Tuesdays. Last month, we were lucky to hear from Eileen Kane, a beautiful presentation, and Rita Efros, who kicked off the series. Her presentation is also available. So today we're going to hear from our congregant, Henry Kunowski, who is an architectural historian. He has wonderful knowledge and insight about the history of the synagogue, the architectural influences, the art, the artisans, the materials, and I'm not going to say too much more about it than that because I want to make sure that Henry has plenty of time to present to us today. So Henry, thank you for being with us to do this, and it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Sally. And can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Okay. I'm sorry. I wasn't sure. Let me just get rid of this. trying to clean up my screen so I can see things. There we go. Okay. And can you see my screen? Have I shared it yet?
Yes.
Yes, you can see the screen.
Just see, we see
Yes.
your poster.
Okay,
Yes.
okay, great. Okay, thank you, thank you. Thank you to the committee for hosting this and inviting me to participate in the Teaching Tuesday. I have given this slideshow in the past. It changes pretty much every time I make a presentation. And so where we are today is in part one of what is a two-part series, and I'm actually working on a third part slowly, and possibility of giving that third part sometime at the OJM CHE in the fall. And if that occurs, I will get the word out to the CBI community. The slideshow it's long, it's dense, and so I'm going to move through it fairly quickly. And if you see something you want to ask a question about, I'll try to pick that up at the end of the presentation. The arc we're going to follow today through time starts in the temporal and ends in the temple. No pun intended. So it is broken into 6 parts. It is the temporal overview, architectural context, sanctuary precedent in the Byzantine, the architectural context and precedent in the Lombardic of Congregation Beth Israel, design development and the synthesis of form, Betza Ali and the art of the craft, and finally conclusions, the test of the theory. So let me just start, see if this works. There we go. A sacred place is a defined place or space distinguished from other places. A sacred place focuses attention on the form, objects, and actions in it, and reveal them as bearers of religious, spiritual meaning and references to the ultimate context of a culture that are often expressed in the conviction that sacred space is not arbitrary. The most successful places of worship have at least one thing in common: architecture that transforms raw earthly materials into compositions so powerful they evoke something beyond our world. It can also be a special place or a personal place in the natural landscape, such as the traditional cultural properties for indigenous peoples, pilgrims on a vision quest, or for us here, a hike in the Columbia River Gorge. Religious and spiritual themes are the eternal truths that lie behind the stories, images, and metaphors that religion never tire of telling. They are beyond empirical demonstrations. They are what religion is all about. Architecture becomes a conception of space, and designers worked with voids and infinity. Through their reasoning mind, they logically designed and constructed a building in which space was no longer rational. This acceptance of ultimate, unlimited space submerged the self into suggested infinity. Through stone and glass, a person could have a peek at God. Abbot Singer of St. Denis around 1081 to 1151, the time of Maimonides, was a French abbot, statesman, and historian. He was one of the earliest patrons of Gothic architecture and is widely credited with popularizing the style. And we'll talk more about Gothic architecture later. He is quoted as saying, "When the house of God, many colors as the radiance of precious jewels, calls me from the cares of this world, then holy meditation led my thoughts of piety, exhausted my soul from the materials to the immaterial, and I seemed to find myself, as it were, in some strange part of the universe, which was neither wholly of the baseness of earth, but by the grace of God, I seem lifted in a majestic manner from this lower towards the upper sphere. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. The Arts of Public Prayer by Lawrence Hoffman. He speaks about the arts conspiring to give the unified picture of the universe favored by the building designer. For Jews, then, the place we call sacred tell the tale of who we are, where we have come from, and where we believe we are going. In that sense, yes, it is brick and mortar, but evokes something else in our soul, a sense of place, a sense of community. Temple Beth Israel is referred to as a house of assembly, a house of prayer, and a house of study. The sanctuary was dedicated on April 27th, 1928. The temple at Congregation Beth Israel is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It is listed by Sacred Spaces International as one of 10 such spaces in Portland. It is listed as one of 10 sacred places in America by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And finally, Temple Beth was featured in the Public Broadcasting Service documentary, God in America, and co-produced by American Experience and Frontline in 2016. In looking at Congregation Beth Israel developmental history, we look towards how did we get to where we are? And it's not a direct path. It is not an indirect path. It is multiple paths in multiple directions, all at the same time. You know a building is successful in part when you see it immortalized in the community in different vestiges. Without necessarily any reference, becomes an icon of the community. While in some cases, the most famous buildings become salt and pepper shakers, as the Vista House in the Columbia River Gorge has become. Here we see a model of Temple Beth as part of a larger urban wood model that the city uses for making design decisions about the context of new buildings. Here it is in a terrazzo inlay in the lobby of the 1900 Southwest 4th building, along with other images of city architecture. And this should be familiar to a lot of people. The Robert P. Weil Administrative Foyer, the tapestry detailed by Judith Paxton Fox. The place of the community that the temple has in the community is also obvious from various vantage points. Other than a hot air balloon, we could see the temple there on the right, the dome, prominent dome. And then on the right, you see the dome in the context of the city looking towards Mount Tabor. And here, another vantage point looking towards the West Hills, excuse me. Another more simple view showing the Cooch property, Cooch Park across the street. And then up and on the right, above and below is the original temple, what was called the original Temple Memorial House, now the Sherman Education Center, also designed by Herman Brookman after the war. This follows his tradition of looking at the Romanesque architecture in a sort of a strict classical form. So he was continuing that sense of architecture, but also if you look at the original plans for the campus, this development was envisioned before it was built. Something would go in this spot, creating our beloved plaza. Many years ago, some of you may remember the awning that used to go along the pathway that you see up above. And when it was deteriorated and needed replacement, the decision was made to not replace it and simply provide umbrellas if need be. That way, the sense of the plaza and the architecture of the space would reveal itself. And once the Kahanas arrived in town, they saw the value and appreciated the opportunities to create our now beloved Shabbat in the plaza. Very unusual history for our congregation, not all of it related to buildings per se, but by 1852, Temple Beth was beginning to form, and it formally came together in 1858. But you get a sense of what Portland looked like on the upper left there in 1852. Mud streets, stables, the West Hills to the south, more towards the Markham Gulch. And then by 1876, the town was becoming more developed. Between 1861 and 1888, the congregation had its own little Gothic revival building in town. Nothing particularly Jewish about it. And you can see its place in the community if you look on the lower right, where it's encircled. That was our congregation for almost 20 years, or over 20 years. And so that also then outgrew its function, and a decision was made to build a yet larger temple for our congregation. The congregation hired William H. Warren, who was an architect born in New York. He was an architect who spent most of his career working in the state of Oregon. Starting in 1860, he apprenticed in San Francisco as a draftsman at the architectural firm of his father. Always helpful to have some nepotism. He's also most famously known, because it's one of his few remaining buildings, as the designer for what is now called the Old Church, or formerly the Calvary Presbyterian Church, in a Gothic carpenter style. How many have you experienced the space? It's quite lovely. And then you can see our sanctuary on the right, built in the Moorish Gothic architectural style. And there's that Gothic again. The Moorish influence is particularly significant in these upper towers. And we'll talk about two towers later, and I'm not referring to Lord of the Rings either. The building was very prominent in Portland. It was can be seen from the east side, and it was one of those character defining features of the city by the 1890s. A number of congregations moved out of the downtown, at that time, the downtown section of Portland, and moved west. One reason was, of all the fires that occurred downtown, was just safer to get a little further west. So here we are in this trio of congregations. Temple Beth on the left, in the middle is I believe the First Unitarian, and down the street on the right is the Central Presbyterian. So Portland Jewish community became a part of that larger congregational community within the city of different denominations. This is the interior of the sanctuary at that time. And you can see it has upper galleries. Still, again, a Reformed temple, so the women weren't banished to the gallery space. But that's a significant feature that we'll talk about a little bit more later. About, I don't know how many years, 20, 30 years after the congregation had built this. And later they built behind the building on the west, that is still there, but now an attorney office, they built the Education Center. So our equivalent now of the Sherman Education Center. And that's still there if you want to go look at it. It's at corner of 12th and Main. Unfortunately, a mysterious fire destroyed the building on December 29th, 1923. And needless to say, it was pretty devastating. There are two artifacts that were salvaged from the fire. One is the menorah you see in the Littman foyer, and the other is the eternal light you see above the current bema in our current temple. So think about that metaphorically. I think it's pretty amazing. So when your building's destroyed, your congregation is growing, and you look for someplace else to go and build another type of building, the congregation looked around town and found that the Captain George Flanders house on Flanders Street, this photograph from around 1910, came on the market. The wife of Captain Flanders put the house on the market after her husband died and couldn't manage the property. So it went on the market and the congregation decided to buy the property. If you look at the lower part of the screen, you'll see that stone wall that's still there. As a matter of fact, that is the entrance to our towards our porte cochere. So some remnant of that is still remaining. And the street trees now are, I don't know, 80 feet tall. So you have a building, and you have some ideas, and you look at the context of the time, and then you need to hire an architect. So this is where Herman Brookman came into the life of our community. Herman Brookman is an architect. He was one of the first architects in Oregon to receive a fellowship in the AIA. He and Pietro Beluschi were two of the first architects to become fellows. Other than some public and Jewish religious education, Brookman had no formal architectural education. He was born in New York, and he retired and passed away in Lake Spur, California, in the north of the Bay Area. He did attend Cooper Union Art School to pursue his love of art, drawing, and painting. At age 18, he dropped out of school to pursue his true passion, that of architecture and landscape, and ended up apprenticing himself as an office boy and later draftsman in the architectural firm of Albro and Lindbergh in 1909. He spent the next 10 years with the firm until 1919, which at that time had become the firm of Harry T. Lindbergh, architect, in 1914 with Albro's departure. During his time with the firm, Brookman worked on at least 25 residential projects in which Lindbergh served as the principal designer. Brookman left the firm in 1919 to work on his own and travel to Europe. In 1921, with his family on an architectural tour of Europe, as a young man, next to architecture, he loved landscapes and had done pastels and continued his practice while on the European tour. And there you see some of his pastel drawings. I almost bought an original last month, but it was sold before I can get my hands on it. In 1923, he received a cable at his cottage in Hastings on the English Channel from Oscar Bach with an offer to design a country estate for M. Lloyd and Edna Frank in Portland, Oregon, a commission he quickly accepted. Brookman remained in Portland for 40 years and retired to Larkspur, California in 1964. One of the interesting things about little context, two things. When he was working in Lindbergh's office, he was there with a couple of other architecture students who were working as draftsmen or office boys, both educated at Columbia University in architecture. And one afternoon, the two of them approached Brookman and said, here we are working as apprentices. We're not getting paid. We're not even getting paid for our trolley fare to the office. we're going to approach Lindbergh and ask him if he could at least compensate us for our trolley fare. And Brookman said, no, not interested. So they approached Lindbergh with that request, and Lindbergh summarily fired them. So Harry Thomas Lindbergh, 1879 to 1959, there is no information regarding Lindbergh's formal education. However, he did serve as a protege to Charles McKim, Charles McKim of McKim, Mead and White in New York City offices from February 1901 until March 1906. 3 months, he left 3 months before White's murder in June. And the murder of White is a whole story in and of itself that has been memorialized in a few movies and several books. Later that year, Lindbergh joined up with Louis Carl Albro, another McKim, Mead and White employee, to form the architectural firm of Albro and Lindbergh, which lasted from 1906 to 1940. Back in the 1930s, Lindbergh was called the world's most independent and original exponent of the traditional form of architecture. Lindbergh designed houses which are found from Long Island to Texas. And he was considered the Yankee Lutyens, rambling, spatially inventive, imbued with vernacular. And we'll talk about Lutyens later. Oh, by the way, that color photograph across from Lindbergh, that landscape was designed by the Olmsted brothers. And that's a significant fact that we'll cover later in terms of Brookman's work. With McKim, Mead and White, or specifically with McKim studied architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris before joining the office of Henry Hobson Richardson in 1870. McKim formed his own firm in a partnership with William Rutherford Mead. Later in 1877, the partners were joined by fellow Richardson protege Stanford White. For 10 years, the firm was principally known for their open plan informal houses. McKim became best known, however, as the exponent of the Beaux-Arts architecture and style that exemplifies the American Renaissance. So what you see here are a few of his houses, particularly the one up above, the Low House, which was influenced by the shingle style, which is what Richardson was known for, is his shingle style. And that several examples of that in this country. The other significant influence in Brookman's work, or Lindbergh's work, was Lutyens, who's an architect and born in 1857 and lived until 1941. In 1882, he set up his own practice in Westminster, England, carrying out surveys and alterations. In the following years, he concentrated mainly on decorative work and was a founding member of the Artworks Guild in 1884. The Artworks Guild gave rise to the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society. From 1883, he concentrated on designs for fabrics and wallpapers until his first architectural commission, a house for H.M. Larkin at Bishop's Itchington in England, led to further offers of architectural work. And there you can see his influence in what Lindbergh and Brookman encountered. Let's see where we are here. Give me a second. Okay. According to Christopher Hussey, who is Lutyens' biographer, in his lifetime, Lutyens was widely held to be our greatest architect since Christopher Wren, if not, as many maintained, his superior. Christopher Wren was considered the go-to architect, sort of the Frank Gehry of England at the time, if that makes any sense. And now we have Vorsi. Charles Francis Vorsi, born in 1857. In 1882, he set up his own practice in Westminster, England, carrying, oh, I'm sorry, I already covered that. I'm falling behind. Just an example of some of his work, a pillbox cloisonne that you can see there in the middle left, and below one of his wallpaper designs. And again, the influence of the Gothic. So when we look at these issues of Gothic architecture, arts and crafts architecture, there's a lot of background to that. A lot of it coming out of the Romantic movement in art. A number of schools were begun in the middle of the 19th century. And one of our own architects here in town also attended one of those schools. And so a number of those schools were not just design, but also learning the craft itself. So you could design a vase, but then you would also learn how to make the vase and fire it, etc. And so that influenced architects, the European architects. Some of the more well-known are John Ruskin, who worked a lot with William Morris, and many of you have probably heard of the Morris chair or Morris's wallpaper and other decorative arts. Lutyens worked with Gertrude Jekyll, who was the star landscape architect in Europe at the time, and much has been written about her. Then when you look at the Oregon architects that were influenced by the arts and crafts movement, we have Ellis Lawrence, who is the founder of the School of Architecture and Allied Arts at the University of Oregon in 1913. He designed many structures in Portland, not just residential, but a number of the restroom structures in Portland parks, the rec center, and the gazebo band shelter at Peninsula Park. Wade Pipes went to school in Europe and went to some of these schools. Edgar Lazarus designed the Vista House and a number of houses in Portland, was considered the go-to architect for a period of time, and then Herman Brookman. Some of the residential work that Brookman is identified with while working in Lindbergh's office, Lindbergh and Albro's office, can be seen there starting in 1909. So all of these were his influences. But it's also important to remember that the genesis of design consideration is one of constantly looking and seeing and interpreting and reevaluating and then looking again and then repeating. So when you look at this 1821 painting, The Haywain by John Constable, you can see here.
We can't see the slide that you're talking about. We're still on slide 25.
Oh, you are?
Yes.
Oh. Let me see here. What is going on? Slide 25. Let me see what that slide looks like. Can you see this one? This new one? No? I wonder if it's frozen up.
It's on the Lutyens slide.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. You're way back there. Is that the Lutyens slide you see?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you see the next one, which is Vorse?
No, nothing's moving.
Really?
Henry, you might want to stop share and reshare. That'll kind of reset it for you.
Okay, let me try that. So excuse me, all. All right, we'll go back to share. Chelsea, can you, oh, there it is again. Okay. And then let's go to view. Can you see Vorse now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. I'm sorry. My apologies. All right. So this is the list I just covered of architects and influences. Can you see this list of residential work?
Yes.
Okay, So the painting I was talking to is referenced before. It's part of the Romantic movement, and you can see that house there on the left. And then if you look at the painting, beautiful hilly landscape in 1900, you can see this cottage. You see my little cursor pointing to the cottage?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. That becomes the genesis, if you will, of the influence of the Gothic residential architecture. Here are some additional properties that Brookman worked on. And then you see the Great Barn at Hammondsworth?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Oh boy, something's showing up here. Oops. For some reason, this is getting strange. There it is. Okay, forgive the arrows. I'm not quite sure where those came from. This is referred to as the inspiration for, or the genesis for Gothic residential architecture, this barn from 1425. And it is something, a form, a basic form that you'll see throughout in the residential work that Lindbergh practiced and was a major influence on the work of Brookman. And so here's an example of a residence, a Lindbergh residence. Another example, some of the arts and crafts detailing, which this is replicated here in Portland at the Harry A. Green estate. More of that Gothic influence, influences for Brookman, some of the details. And I'm not quite sure how to get rid of those arrows, but and then we have the M. Lloyd Frank Manor House, early rendering by Brookman when he came out to town. This is the vision he presented to Lloyd Frank. And this is what we have. Chelsea, if there's any way you can help me remove those arrows, that would be greatly appreciated. Do you guys see the arrows?
Yes, but
You
then
might
Oops.
be annotating your screen, which I can
Okay.
walk you through, but it would be a couple steps.
You want to try that or just forget it?
It's up to you. Is it going to be
It's
distracting
a little
for
bit
you?
of a distraction. So let's try to get rid of them.
Okay, so if you bring your mouse to the top of your screen, Henry,
Yes.
there's some, and then you,
Annotate.
and then you can unclick it.
Unclick it.
There's usually a little check mark by it,
Yeah, I'm looking for it.
and then there's maybe a little menu you see,
Ah,
and you can
got it.
see clear
All right,
all
thank you.
drawings.
that did it.
There you
It's
go.
gone. Thank you. Okay. So again, the M. Lloyd Frank Manor House, now the administrative offices and president's office at Lewis and Clark College, available for touring once they open the campus. I do a separate slideshow just on the architecture and design of this house. And the same with, now I can't move forward. Get rid of that and see if that works. No, up there, sorry. The other commission that Brookman won was the Harry A. Green residence in North Portland on Ankeny. And this is the final product. You can begin some of the influences that would carry over to Temple Beth. So the congregation has its architects, it has its property. So the next step was to break ground, the southeast corner of the foundation in April 1926. Let me take a look at this. So Brookman was retained, but it wasn't that simple. He did not at the time have capacity to take on such a large project. And so Harry Herzog was a member of the congregation, but as such, he could not take the commission. So he served as the congregational representative to the architects during the construction process. John V. Bennis, who has considerable experience in commercial structures, was brought on board as a consultant. John did a lot of work on the campus of OSU. But to get the work done, the drawings done, and into production, they all worked with Morris Whitehouse office for production purposes. So they became the architects of record on the drawings. Rumor has it that they love the project, they love to work on it, but they hated it when Brookman would show up in the office. So give me a second here. So Brookman was a unique individual, to say the least. According to Gene Westberg, who was an architect that worked for Brookman for 2 years, the longest employee he ever had, he said that I worked for a man who totally obsessed with beauty and let little else interfere with his obsession. Beauty was Brookman's obsession in the application of his talent, in the appropriate use of materials and the husbanding of materials and of space and of vistas. And in the process, he let little else clutter his mind, including money. According to his son, Bernard, his landscapes were outstanding. It was one thing other than architecture he really loved to do. According to Saul Zake, a local architect who was a friend and colleague of Brookman's, he said, all architects have the quest to make something perfect. I think Brookman came as close to that with the Frank House. And according to Bob Wilmson, architect of Wilmson and Endicott Architects, a firm I used to work for, Bob indicated his standards for design and practice were exceptional for his time and moment in the Northwest architectural profession. He had far more influence in the design profession than any other known architect would ever admit. See if I can move to the next screen. Oh, there we go. Okay. The next issue is, while we've talked about Gothic architecture and its influence on the residential, we're now going to shift into the architectural influence of our main sanctuary, which is in form the Byzantine. So through time, the basilica, as was come to be known, took different forms in plan. There was the Baroque, the Romanesque, Lombardy, Greek cross plans, all variations on a theme of worship. But if you look here to the lower left, you'll see the basic influence of the Romanesque Lombardy architecture that was used for Temple Beth. In more detail here, we can see the basic form of the Byzantine with its central dome, flanking structures, and the image on the left, San Vital, around 526, gives you a sense of an inspiration for the floor plan for Temple Beth. On the lower left is the first Gothic, or excuse me, Byzantine church known. It doesn't look like that anymore. That it's pretty much in ruin, but this is a rendering that was done in the late 1800s before it collapsed. And as we look at Temple Beth, look to the lower right, you see the basic form that is utilized at Temple Beth. With, if you can see the red circle is the basic form of the dome that then translate that structure down to the ground, which is somewhat reflected on the interior shot of Hagia Sophia up on the upper right. And the most well-known Byzantine sanctuary, which has gone through various iterations of Muslims, Christianity. That upper lithograph is from 1852. But the Byzantine Empire, also referred to as the Eastern Roman Empire of the Byzantium, was the continuation of the Roman Empire in the Eastern province during the late antiquity and the Middle Ages when its capital was Constantinople, named after the Roman emperor of the time, Constantine. So you could begin to now see that pretty much Rome and the Romanesque influence was leaving Italy around 330. And the next influence on architecture started occurring around 500 CE. If we look to existing Jewish synagogues around this country, we can see that Temple Beth Zion 1889, was an influence that Brookman could have observed, or the Cam Isaiah Israel Temple, which is a contemporary of our synagogue. And the other example, and one of our sister congregation, is Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco of 1925. They were actually a lot of exchanges of information and vision shared between the two congregations of how they got to what they have. While the form of this sanctuary, and we'll see this along the way, it has Romanesque qualities, particularly up here in the gable ends. Those are referred to, it's a classic Romanesque detail referred to as blind arches. But the real key influence on our congregation is that of the Steelstrasse synagogue in Essen, Germany, 1914, designed by Edmund Kunner. It was considered the first modern Jewish temple in Germany at the time. The interior was destroyed at Kristallnacht. And so how many of you can see the reference here to Temple Beth? Pretty obvious. And here are some interior images of the sanctuary. Oops, sorry. And right here is Kristallnacht, when the sanctuary was burnt down. Again, easy for Brookman to see, particularly at his time of traveling to Europe and touring temples. And then if you look at the upper right, you see the priestly blessing image, which translates into our own synagogue. And here's an interior rendering of the synagogue. If you look at the oculus and the dome, it is pretty well where we are with Temple Beth, including the arched windows, tripart windows. Again, the gallery seating, which we had considered but never was manifest, the suspended light fixtures, and the modillions with various Jewish imagery. So as we've looked at the Byzantine, and now we're going to look at the decorative motif of the Lombardic within the sanctuary. The Lombardic area of architecture in Italy is reflected on the left in the black and white. You can see all those little temples, or churches that were part of the influence of the Lombardic, and their capital was Ravenna. Some say that Ravenna was the origins of the Masonic movement because they had the absolute best masons around, and they traveled the region consulting on a lot of architecture. Lombardic is also has different names depending on which culture you're talking about. When I first learned about it through a whole other set of circumstances, it was called the Longbeards. And there's another story there related to Norse culture, which I'll share at some other time. So what do we have with the Lombardic? We have basically the Lombardic existed from around 550 CE to 800 CE. And the term Lombardic architecture refers to the architecture of the kingdom of the Lombards in Italy, with residual prominence in southern Italy until the 10th, 11th centuries, with architecture commissioned by Lombard kings and dukes. Lombard was a kingdom ruled by the Germanic Lombards, who had controlled most of Italy since the invasion of Byzantine Italy in 568 Common Era. As such, Lombard and Italy were almost interchangeable. Many peculiarities assert themselves in which the vaulted basilicas of the Lombardy differ from those of other countries. This occurs particularly in the facade. And I can see here we're going to run out of time. soon. So I'll just show you some images of the Lombard in the more vernacular sense. In the more formal sense, again, the more vernacular sense. And then we are beginning to see the blind arches of the Romanesque. And does this look familiar to anybody? It's Lombardic in form, but you begin to see the Romanesque detailing. This was Brookman's inspiration for the facade of Temple Beth Israel, dating back to 1115 of the Common Era. Interior, many similarities, including some Jewish motifs, decorative motifs, and then the influence of Lombardy architecture in its detailing. And then with Congregation Beth Israel, the design development and the synthesis of form. One of the early sketches by Brookman just was very conceptual, a sense of form, but nothing truly defined. And he slowly began to refine those ideas. And if you look at this facade and this facade, there's virtually no difference, including these windows to the side, Begin more formalization of the design, more conceptual. And then you can see here, he was still not satisfied with the facade, playing with both a Jacobean form, a gable end, and an arch, trying to figure out what are we going to do. And he's still playing with those forms. But by this point, it's becoming a little more refined to what we know now. Let me just move something here so I can see where I am. Okay. So when the building was being designed, the architects had only one minor request from the congregation, that there would be two towers reminiscent of the previous 1888 temple. These could also be reference to Boaz and Yakin of King of Solomon's temple. And here we have those two columns represented and referred to by, according to the first century Romano-Jewish scholar Josephus' book on antiquities of the Jews, Boaz, he, him, it, strength, stood on the left of the portico of Solomon's temple, while Yakin, he, it, was established, stood on the right. And the two were made by an Israelite craftsman named Hirene Abif. So if you look at the doorknob, a doorknob in the sanctuary, you'll see a B and a J in the doorknob, referring to these two towers, again, referring to strength and establishment. And here we end up with the two towers, what they look like, and the dome form in its final construction documents. And the rendering of what was envisioned that the main entrance of the congregation would be from Gleason, not Flanders. The form of the original form had the gallery concept around the sides, a central aisle, but the rabbi demanded that be removed for two flanking aisles. He did not want to follow the precedent set in other basilicas of the Christian faith. And that was more formalized, again, with the galleries around the side, the two towers, the stairs, the upstairs balcony, and the final plan. And then the interior reminiscent of some of those sketches of the Lombardic, with the blind arches in particular. And this is the building under construction. A number of the 7 doors have above the lintel, this one says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations." And then here is the inaugural committee in April 27th, 1927. And what we have today. Again, with the decorative motif being from the Lombardic. And while we could go into the sanctuary and look at it, I thought it'd be really quick to go up onto the roof through this series of interior ladders up to the dome, climbing up there into the vent cupola, through the structure, into the source of light for the Star of David in the oculus, and then through the Star of David into the dome itself. Looking at some of the details and decorative motifs, and of course, the very familiar space, including the Celtic pattern inlaid in the terrazzo floor of the entry. Some of the material is well known. Gustavio Vino tile. The author of a book on the subject came out to tour the temple, and it is in his book. And some of the other decorative motifs found in the Lombardic and other decorative motifs that Brookman picked up from his tours. And then I'm going to try to, I don't know how quickly, I'm going to need some advice here from the committee on end here or continue moving forward. Okay.
Chelsea, are we able to go a little over for people who?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. How
Okay.
about we,
What?
Henry, how about we go another 15 minutes? If people need to
Perfect.
leave, we understand.
Okay. Let's talk about Betzalel. Under Exodus 31, 1-5, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, "See, I have singled out by name Betzalel, son of Ur, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. I have endowed him with a divine spirit of skill, ability, and knowledge in every kind of craft, to make designs for work in gold, silver, and copper, to cut stone for setting, and to carve wood, to work in every kind of craft." And here you can see him trying to think, what is that ark going to look like? You want two cherubs facing each other. Okay. So here we have him with his different craftsmen, and here on the lower right, he has crafted the Ark of the Covenant and placed the two tablets of the Torah inside of them. When we look at the equivalents in part, on a contemporary level, we have Oscar Bach, who does metalwork. Oscar Bach is the gentleman who referred Lloyd Frank to Herman Brookman. Lloyd Frank would spend time out on the East Coast shopping for Myron Frank, and had worked with Bach on several acquisitions, and asked him, could he reference an architect who'd be willing to come out to Oregon and work on a house for him? And that's when Bach cabled Brookman. Some of the metalwork that Bach performed on our organ screen, and other details, decorative details around the sanctuary, including this little sort of dragon. He loved to do dragons and hide them in different places in the sanctuary, or sanctuaries, or temples, or churches. So, little project for people to find this. I think Rabbi knows where it is. The other artist that Brookman worked with was Frederick Baker, who was an artisan light designer. This gentleman, I'm having a heck of a time finding a lot of information about him, Johann Turek, but there's a lot written about him. And let me just read a few of those things. He was one of Oregon's most prominent metal designers and founders of the Portland Art Metalwork. He was the metalwork designer for Temple Beth Israel. He served a 2-year apprenticeship with his uncle as an art metal worker. He arrived in America in 1888 and in Portland in 1890. After he established his own ironworks, he provided much of the ornamental ironwork in the city, railings for city parks, reservoirs, decorations for U.S. Customs House, and on and on. It is a matter of gratification to the many of the friends of Mr. Turek, proprietor of the Portland Art Metalworks, which used to be located at 9th and Davis, that his exhibit at the Lewis and Clark Exposition of 1905 won the highest award, a gold medal, for his work. And this is one of my favorite, his details. The next key artist is Albert Gerlach, who worked with the congregation for probably maybe 30 years or more. When the congregation first opened in April of 27, there were no stained glass windows except for the two rose windows. A number of the drawings that Gerlach did for the stained glass windows were dated 1945. So between the time the temple opened, we have the Depression, the World War, then the congregation came back to work with him. He was a stained glass artist who studied at the Chicago Institute. He practiced as chief designer for the W.P. Fuller studio here in Portland. And by 1930, Fuller bought out Portland's Povey Brothers, which probably produced more of the stained glass windows in Portland than any other firm. W.P. Fuller sold off the stained glass window portion of the company to Albert Gerlach and Bryce Anderson. In the early 1950s, Gerlach started his own stained glass company for CBI. He worked with Peter Sakolek, Margot Hessler Austin, Mabel Johnson, and Amy Gurman and C. Bryce Anderson. In 1947, Anderson worked on the stained glass of the Szymanski Chapel in the Sherman Education Center, or then Temple Memorial House. In 1926, the CBI Building Committee took the task of commissioning stained glass for the new temple in a manufactured competition. Many submitted entries, including Tiffany and Company of New York. When the temple opened on April 28, 1928, there were no stained glass windows. The final two-scale design layouts for stained glass were dated to 1945. Gerlach worked on these projects for 20 years. And it took that long because the temple was working on finding subscription donors, and their names would become illustrated at the bottom of the stained glass windows. According to Gerlach, the importance of stained glass is in its relationship to architecture is not sufficiently appreciated by most people. In a church or cathedral, the colored windows absolutely dominate the decorative scheme of the interior. Without its glass, the interior of Chartres would be dignified and noble, but its power to enchant would be gone. And here is, for those of you who have been there, you can understand that expression.
Yes.
One of his apprentices that I mentioned, Amy Spencer Gorman, very talented artist in her own right, worked in various media. A lot of her work is around town, including the Irvington School. And she was the only woman to be ever selected an honorary member of the American Institute of Architects. So when the stained glass window decorative motif was being discussed, a classic reference is made to Jacob. And he called unto his sons and said, gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which fate shall befall you in the end of days. The blessings of Jacob is a prophetic poem that appears in Genesis at 49, 1-27, and mentions each of Jacob's 12 sons. Genesis presents the poem as the words of Jacob to his sons when Jacob is about to die. Unlike Moses, Jacob is not afraid to castigate some of the tribe, in particular Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. And if you come to Torah study, you'll know why. So briefly, and this is sort of a point of departure in part two when I get into the weeds on the stained glass window narrative. But basically, there's a decorative motif and narrative to the stained glass that starts on your right when you walk into the sanctuary and goes counterclockwise. They all have themes, basically, reflected the days of creation. And when you look, the sons of Jacob and Joseph, asterisk, the tribes of Israel, each with their own fate that befell them. The asterisk has to do with Manasseh and Ephraim. They are considered part of the patriarchy, and their names are reflected, but they are not the 12 sons of Jacob. Each of the 6 panels have 3 tripart windows, each with a narrative going through them. And here are an example of some of those narratives and who it refers to, and why the decorative motifs took on the form that they did. And with that, let's end with a couple of comments. Earlier, I talked about these conceptual pieces of ideas. What constitutes a sacred space? What are the influences and the forces of a sacred space, and how they affect people and bring them to be in touch with God or a higher being? That's all well and good in architectural theory, but the truth, as they say, is in the pudding. Glenn Stanton, who wrote for the Pacific Coast Architecture magazine in August 1928, wrote, it was especially gratifying to the architects that the materials and craftsmen employed in the building of this temple were assembled on the coast and chiefly in the environs of Portland. The concrete, the brick, the terracotta, the excellent roof tile, the fine carving, the paneling, and the decorations all are examples of local ability and skill. It is encouraging to those who may despair of the passing of real craftsmanship to find such capacity for cooperation and production in our own community. That's 1928. But herein lies one more truth of the concept. And this from the rabbi at the time of construction who was transitioning from Rabbi Weiss. And Rabbi Berkowitz was a very, very big influence on the decorative motif of the sanctuary, and particularly the narrative of the stained glass window. And this was his comment on the dedication. The sanctuary is exquisite in beauty as a polished gem, will only enhance its ability to inspire all men and women who seek spiritual help within its walls. It is a lyric poem in brick and stone, and I have never seen anything like it in either this country or in Europe. And then finally, Herman Brookman, when he left town, gave his library to his colleagues, and this is what he wrote to Saul Zake when he turned over one of his books to Saul. I want to thank the CBI Teaching Tuesday group, especially Sally, Rita, Rosie, Anita, and Chelsea for her support. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Henry. This is fabulous. And I just wanted to point out that we're going to have part 2 in a few months. Part 2 will focus on the stained glass windows. If we can get Henry's time back again, we'd love to have you back. Thanks so much. And this is recorded, so go to the CBI website.
And I have 3 compliments to tell you, Henry, from the chat. And first is thanks from Janet Zell, very good history. Second, fascinating presentation. Thanks from Paul and Mimi. Thank you so much, Henry, for your expertise and passion. We are so lucky, from Rabbi Joseph. And thanks from the committee. Another thanks, Henry. Great job from Mary.
Thank you.
It's fascinating. I'm so glad to be a part of this committee that invited you. Thank you. You're a treasure.
Thank you. Any questions? Oh, I see one from Susan. Yes.
One question. That gorgeous mosque was in your first or second or third slide. Where is that?
That is in Istanbul.
That's not the Hagia Sophia, is it?
Yeah, yes.
Oh, I haven't been there. I have to go. Okay, thank you. That was wonderful.